In this video, I will discuss about the deadlock. Deadlocks in distributed systems are very similar to deadlocks in single process systems. They are very hard to avoid and prevent or even detect and harder to cure when tracked down because all the relevant information is scattered over many machines. In some systems, such as a distributed database system, they can be extremely severe, so it is important to understand how they differ from ordinary deadlocks and what can be done about them. Some people make a distinction between two kinds of distributed deadlocks, communication deadlocks and resource deadlocks. A communication deadlock occurs, for example, when process A is trying to send a message to process B, which in turn is trying to send one to process C, which is trying to send one to A. There are various scenarios in which this situation leads to deadlock, such as no buffers being available. A resource deadlock occurs when processes are fighting over exclusive access to input-output devices. Examples are files, logs, and other resources. Deadlock is a situation. Deadlock is a situation. It is shown on the screen. Um, the sequence of events required to use resources by a process is as follows. The one is a request. The process first makes a request for the resource. If the requested resource is not available, possibly because it is being used by another process, the requesting process must wait until the requested resource is allocated to it by the system. Note that if the system has multiple units of the requested resource type, the allocation of any unit of type will satisfy the request. Also note that a process may request as many units of a resource as it requests with the restriction that the number of units requested may not exceed the total number of available units of a resource. Allocation. The system allocates the resources to the requesting process as soon as possible. It maintains a table in which it records whether each resource is free or allocated and if it is allocated to which process. If the requested resource is currently allocated to another process, the requesting process is added to a queue of processes waiting for the resource. Once the system allocates the resource to the requesting process, the process can exclusively use the resource by operating it. Third one, release. After process has finished using the allocated resource, it releases the resource to the system. The system table records are updated at the time of allocation and released to reflect the current status of availability of resource. If some processes entered in the waiting state will never change the state because requested resources are held by other waiting process. This situation is called deadlock. Resource can be physical objects, disk drive, tape, central processing unit, RAM, or logical objects. Preemptible meaning that the resource can be taken away from its current owner. An example is memory. Non-preemptible meaning that the resource cannot be taken away. An example is a printer. Necessary condition for a deadlock. Necessary conditions for a deadlock. The Huffman and others in 1971 stated that the following conditions are necessary for a deadlock situation to occur in a system. The first one, mutual exclusion condition. If a resource is held by a process, any other process requesting for that resource wait until the resource has been available. All the wait conditions. Processes are allowed to request for new resources without releasing the resources that they are currently holding. Number three, no preemption condition. A resource that has been allocated to a process becomes available for allocation to another process only after it has been voluntarily released by the process holding it. Number four, circular wait condition. Two or more processes must form a circular chain in which each process is waiting for a resource that is held by the next member of the chain. Deadlock occurs if the following conditions hold simultaneously: mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, and circular wait. Circular wait, it is shown in the diagram. The P0, P1, and P2 and Pn, n number of processes are waiting in for the resources. It is in the circular shape. Deadlock modeling. Deadlocks can be modeled using the directed graph before presenting a graphical model for deadlocks. Some terminology from graph theory is needed. Directed graph. A directed graph is a pair of nodes and edges where n is a non-empty set of nodes and e is a set of directed edges. A directed edge is an ordered pair a comma b where a and b are nodes uh, in the graph n. A path is a sequence of nodes of a directed graph such that a comma b and b comma c are directed edges. Obviously, a path contains at least two nodes. Cycle. A cycle is a path whose first and last nodes are the same. Reachable set. The reachable set of a node A is the set of all nodes B such that the path exists from A to B. Knot. A knot is a non-empty set K of nodes such that the reachable set of each node in K is exactly the set K. A knot always contains one or more cycles. An example of a directed graph is shown in the diagram. Deadlock modeling. The process nodes P1, P2. Resources nodes, it is in the rectangular form R1, R2, R3. The units, resources have more than one unit. Assignment edges, resources node to process node. Request edges, process node to a resource node. Necessary and sufficient conditions for a deadlock. A cycle is necessary condition for a deadlock. The presence of a cycle is necessary condition for a deadlock, but not sufficient. This diagram contains cycle, but does not represent a deadlock. Necessary and sufficient conditions for a deadlock. The sufficient condition for a deadlock is different for the following different cases. Number one, a cycle in the graph is both necessary and a sufficient condition for a deadlock if all the resource types requested by the processes forming the cycle have only a single unit each. For example, the resource allocation graph, as shown in the diagram, shows a deadlock state in which processes P1 and P2 are deadlocked. Notice that in this graph, although there are 3 units of resources, R3, it is not involved in the cycle P1, R2, P2, R1, P1. Both R1 and R2 that are involved in the cycle have only one unit each. Therefore, the cycle represents a deadlock state. Second, a cycle in the graph is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for deadlock. If one or more of the resource types requested by the processes forming the cycle have more than one unit. In this case, a not a sufficient condition for a deadlock. Necessary and sufficient conditions for a deadlock is continued. A cycle is necessary for a deadlock if there is only a single unit in one resource is in cycle. If more than one unit are there in cycle, then a not is sufficient for a deadlock. Wait for graph. When all the resource types have only a single unit each, a simplified form of resource allocation graph is normally used. The simplified graph is obtained from the original resource allocation graph by removing the resource nodes and collapsing the appropriate edges. This simplification is based on the observation that a resource can always be identified by its current owner. It is shown on the screen. An example of a resource allocation graph, and it is in the simplified form. The simplified graph is commonly known as a wait for graph because it clearly shows which processes are waiting for which other processes. For instance, in the wait for graph, the processes P1 and P3 are waiting for P2 and process P2 is waiting for P1. Since wait for graph is constructed only when each resource type has only a single unit, a cycle is both necessary and sufficient condition for deadlock in the wait for graph. The handling the deadlocks, prevention, avoidance, and detection recovery. Handling the deadlocks in distributed system. Deadlocks in distributed systems are similar to deadlocks in centralized systems. Therefore, the description of deadlocks presented above holds good both and centralized and distributed systems. However, handling of deadlocks in distributed systems is more complex than in centralized systems because the resources, the processes, and other relevant information are scattered on different nodes of the system. Three commonly used strategies to handle deadlocks are followed. Number one, avoidance. Resources are carefully allocated to avoid deadlock. Second, prevention. Constraints are imposed on the ways in which processes require resources in order to prevent the deadlock. Third one, detection and recovery. Deadlocks are allowed to occur and a detection algorithm is used to detect them. After a deadlock is detected, it is resolved by certain means. Deadlock prevention. Designing the system in the way that deadlock become impossible. Prevention is different from avoidance because no runtime testing or potential allocations need to be performed. Prevent the one of the four necessary conditions: mutual exclusion condition, hold and wait, no preemption, and circular wait condition. So mutual exclusion, unfortunately, it is not possible to prevent deadlocks by denying mutual exclusion. Cannot be prevented for all the resources. Some resources are intrinsically non-shareable for example, printer, and some are shareable like CPU. Hold and wait. This method denies the hold and wait condition. We must guarantee that whenever a process requests a resource, it does not hold any other resources. Following policies may be used to ensure that a process must request all of its resources before it begins execution. If all the needed resources are available, they are allocated to it. If one or more resources are not available, none will be allocated and process would just wait. Problem and in hold and wait. Low resource uh, utilization because a process may hold many resources but all of them not used. It may cause starvation because whenever a process made a request, resources are not available. No preemption condition. A preemptible resource is one whose state can easily saved and restored later. A resource temporarily taken away from the process without harm to the computation performed by this process. CPU, main memory are preemptible resources. If the resources are preemptible, deadlocks can be prevented. Two policies. Number one, when a process requests for a resource and the resource is not available, it's already held resources taken away from it and the process is blocked. The process is unblocked when the resources available and allocated to it. Second, when a process requests a resource that is not currently available, the system checks if the requested resource is currently held by another process that is already blocked and waiting for other resources. If so, the requested resource is taken away from the waiting process and give to the requesting process, otherwise the condition 1 is applied. Circular wait condition. Each resource is assigned a global number to impose total ordering. Impose a total ordering of all resource type and require that each process can only request resources in an increasing order of enumeration. Process should not request a resource with a number lower than is already held resource. If process request equal to I and process already held resource equal to I, then I must be greater than I. That is, single request will be enough for the same resource type. It is proven that with this, graph can never have a circular wait. Deadlock avoidance. The system dynamically considers every request and decides whether it is safe to grant at this point. Deadlock avoidance use some advanced knowledge of the resource usage of the processes. Following steps are for a deadlock avoidance. When process requests for a resource, even if the resource is available for allocation, it is not immediately allocated to the process. Advanced knowledge to use to perform analysis is to decide whether process request is safe or unsafe. When request is safe, resource allocated, otherwise deferred. As a safe state, a system is considered in safe state if there exists some ordering of process in which run all requests lead to completion. Safe ordering. Any ordering of processes that can guarantee the completion of all the process is called as a safe sequence. In a system, there are 8 units. Of a particular resource type. 3 processes P1, P2, and P3 are competing for the resources. If the resource allocation is not done carefully, the system may move from a safe state to unsafe state. For example, let us consider as shown in the diagram, for one additional unit of the resource and the same is allocated to it by the system. The resulting system state is shown in the part B of the diagram. The system is no longer in a safe state because we have one unit of the resource free, which is not sufficient to run any of the three processes to completion. Therefore, there is no safe sequence for the state of figure as it is shown in the diagram B. Thus, the decision to allocate one unit of the resource to P2 move to the system from a safe state to unsafe state. In the deadlock avoidance, it is important to note the following remarks about safe and unsafe state. The initial state in which no resources are yet allocated is called safe state. Safe state, the system can guarantee that all processes can be run to completion. An unsafe state is not a deadlock state, but it may lead to a deadlock state. The system cannot guarantee that all processes can be run to completion. Due to following reason, avoidance rarely used. Assumption of advanced knowledge is available. However, in practice, processes rarely know in advance what their maximum resource needs will be. Number of processes not known in advance because dynamically varies. Number of units change dynamically. A restriction on resource allocation degrades the system performance. Deadlock detection. It uses algorithm that keeps examining the state of a system to determine whether a deadlock has occurred. When a deadlock has occurred, system takes action to recover. Algorithms are same for centralized as well as a distributed system. It uses resource allocation graph and searching for cycle are not depending upon single or multiple units of resources. Following steps are needed to construct wait for graph. Number one, construct separate resource allocation graph for each site. Resource node exists for all local resources and process node exists for all processes that are either holding or waiting for resource. Number two, construct wait for graph by removing resources and collapsing edges. Number three, take union of all wait for graph of all sites and construct single global wait for graph. Two sites, site 1 with 2 resources and site 2 with 1 resource. P1 is holding R1 and requesting for R3. P2 is holding R2 and requesting for R1. P3 is holding R3 and requesting for R2. Union of wait for graph of two sites will show either deadlock exists or not. Local wait for graph does not contain cycle while global does. The difficulties in this one, maintaining wait for graph of each site is difficult. Most important feature of deadlock detection algorithm is correctness, which depends upon these properties. Number one, progress property. Deadlocks must be detected in finite amount of time. Number two, safety property. Detected deadlock must exist. Messages, delays, and out of date wait for graph cause false cycles to be detected. It results in detection of deadlock that do not exist called phantom clocks.